Welcome to In All Things. I'm Sierra, and I would love to welcome you into my living room to have real conversations with you about everything from forgiveness and personalities to community and discipleship. So let's imagine we're sitting on my couch and encouraging each other to seek Christ in all things. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us for today's conversation. I'm really looking forward to introducing you to Johnny. Johnny, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
We are going to talk about a believer's responsibility in politics, basically, and I'm really excited because it's kind of a touchy topic, I guess, in today's world, but we're going to talk about it from a biblical point of view. So before we get started, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so I'm a family friend of Sierra and her family here, and been kind of involved off and on in politics and getting more involved in the last couple of years, and it's been kind of a hobby of mine. Currently pursuing a business administration degree with emphasis in economics through Liberty University. So that's what I'm currently pursuing and working on.
Awesome. Mm-hmm. Great. This is honestly a topic that I've wanted to do ever since I started this podcast. And I definitely have my own thoughts on everything, but I thought it'd be fun to bring somebody else on too. And you offered to do this over Instagram. So I'm really excited to do this. And I feel like or politics in general has always been like a big taboo topic. It's kind of a running joke. If you watch a movie, it's mentioned like, don't talk about politics with your family and stuff like that. But it's become even more sensitive in the last couple of years. And especially as Christians, like as a whole, we have some very strong opinions, but sometimes they're on like opposite ends of the spectrum. So when I talk about a topic, and especially something like politics, I want to make sure that I'm not just adding to the noise that's to an already noisy conversation, I want to add substance. So I think you're very knowledgeable in this, Johnny, and I'm looking forward to this. So my first question is, as believers, why should we care about politics?
Yeah, so pretty much to summarize my overall point for this, it is to keep evil and wicked men out of power and to preserve peace and security for society in general. Some good references for this that I have for why we should care about these and general principles that warn us about this is found in Proverbs, one of my favorite books. But in Proverbs 29 deals a lot with this in regards to the wicked in places of power. Proverbs 29:2 says, "When the righteous increase, the people rejoice, but when the wicked rule, the people groan. A righteous man knows the rights of the poor. A wicked man does not understand such knowledge. And if a ruler listens to falsehood, all of his officials will be wicked." Proverbs 28 also gives some more references. Proverbs 28:15 says that a roaring lion or a charging bear is a wicked ruler over a poor people. A ruler who lacks understanding is a cruel oppressor, but he who hates unjust gain will prolong his days. So generally, the Bible warns us through Proverbs that when the wicked rule, there is hardship, and we should strive to ensure that the righteous individuals that display godly values are in those positions of power, so that way we can have a polite and prosperous society.
I mean, just as you were reading those couple passages, I don't think we really hear about a lot of Bible verses that talk about the government or talk about leadership and stuff like that. So that's really great. One thing that came to my mind was like our worldview. So if we use the example of abortion, the Bible is beyond clear about the sanctity of life. And as believers, we know that we need to live our lives like reflecting that same value. But then it's also important that we try to make every effort that our society to reflect like the Lord's values and his commands as well. And I think we can do this by caring about politics and being involved in politics, whatever that might look different for other every person being involved. But if we're passive about some of like these more political, quote unquote, topics, then we're passive about biblical topics as well.
Oh, absolutely. And we can kind of look to what a godless government can look like as well. So the 20th century gave us a lot of really good examples of what a godless government will look like. You saw the eugenics that took place under the Nazis. that is in clear violation of the principles in Genesis of that we were created in God's image. You have the godless government of the Soviet Union, who murdered millions of its own peoples to try to justify its own ends. And then even current examples where you have the communist government of China, which has persisted, the only government system that I'm referencing that's persisted, where they're still committing genocide against Christians, Uyghur Muslims, Falun Gong practitioners, and any political dissidents, really. Some really terrible stuff going on there, and you can see that a government that doesn't fear God, or that doesn't have officials that occupy those positions of power that don't fear God, the horrible things that can come as a result of that. And those are some just a couple of examples. And then some more reasons why we should care, specifically for America as well. So our government has a very special place in the world. I've spent some time overseas, and I've seen that the effect and the influence that America has on the political spheres of other countries. We lead by example, whether we want to or not. And so other countries do look up to us. And so by enshrining religious freedom and valuing Christianity and Christian values in our own society, then that will propagate them in other countries as well, just because of our influence that we have in them. Right. And it may not always be direct influence. They just may see how our society generally behaves, and they might try to emulate those ideals and stuff. And so it's important that we our government leads by example on the international stage as well.
I think we can really see that right now. I mean, this is just a crazy timing. We had this organized for like probably the past month, and just in what we're seeing today happening in Russia and Ukraine, we can definitely see that.
So Proverbs also instructs us in Proverbs 31, 8 through 9. Just to give context to the Bible verse, this is words of King Lamell, an oracle that his mother taught him. So this was her preparing him to be a king and to be a ruler. And so it says to open your mouth for the mute, for the rights of all who are destitute. Open your mouth, judge righteously, defend the rights of the poor and needy. And so as you are getting, this was, a mother preparing her son who is going to be an heir to the throne. But us, as we seek power, political power, we should also, think about these things. And as Christians and our role in politics, we should be thinking about opening our mouth for the mute, for those who are destitute, and to be able to take those positions of power to judge righteously and defend the rights of the poor and needy. So,
wow, that's so important. I think we can all probably come up with examples in our head of how that can apply.
Yes.
To our politics today. Well, when I think of our last presidential election, not that anyone's ever going to forget that one, but we saw just so much division on what Christians should do when it comes to voting. Some people were very strongly leaning one way, others were strongly leaning the other way, and then there were just others that just thought that there wasn't not a good choice in that election, and so Christians should not vote at all, basically. And so my question is, do Christians have the responsibility to vote?
In short, yes.
Okay.
To be quite frank, yes, we do. This is how we make our voices heard. This is how we get our respectable, God-fearing men and women into public office. And that is a very important first step in order to ensure that the Christian values are enshrined and protected within our government. So example would be like to not vote would be removing kind of the salt and light from politics, which is very necessary. And we know we've seen how dirty and dark the world of politics can be, especially with all the scandals and stuff that come out in the last couple of years. And so removing that salt and light from our political system is something that we would do to our own detriment. And this is something that the Founding Fathers knew was an essential part of any free society, was having a moral populace that engaged in the political system. So that way the morals and values would be protected through the government and would be espoused by that government. So building off of that we need to make sure that our salt and light are preserved in government. We have the founders' syllogism, which was that the proposition that a Republican government required a moral citizenry and that religion was necessary for morality. Benjamin Rush, one of my favorite founding fathers, was quoted as saying, The only foundation for a useful education in a republic is to be laid in religion. Without this, there can be no virtue, and without virtue, there can be no liberty. And liberty is the object in life of all republican governments. Additionally, another one of my favorite, and one that will be more well known, was George Washington. In his farewell address, he states that of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indisputable supports. In vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism who should labor to subvert these great pillars of human happiness. And so we can see that religion, especially in our founding fathers and in our government, was an integral part. And so they wanted a moral populace to be involved in the government because they knew that in order for it to have a moral government, it needs to be occupied by moral and righteous people.
Right.
So.
That is so important. So how do we know who to vote for then?
Yes. So how do we know who to vote for? So one thing I will preface this with is we must be very cautious as Christians to support any individual who does not strongly recognize the sovereignty of God. My basic argument for this is if they don't recognize God, how can they recognize your God-given rights?
Yeah.
So the simple answer is they won't.
Yes.
And they will see them as obstacles and not as something that needs to be protected and not as attributes. And so building off of that then, when we look to our political leaders or prospective political leaders that we are going to elect or support, we need to look at their private lives. Really, that's the best indication. People reveal who they are in their private lives and in what they portray to those around them.
Right.
And so we should look for the fruit of the Spirit in their lives, and it should be evident. But also, we need to be cautious of any acts of the flesh that are present in their lives.
Sure.
And those are all listed in Galatians 5:16 through 25, and very evident. And then for my own standards of when I look for someone, I look at the same standards for overseers in the church. If we are going to elect overseers for a political purpose, and since the government has taken on a large portion of the responsibilities of the church in the last 100 years, in terms of welfare and caring for the poor and needy, then we should try to hold the same standards for our governmental overseers as those in the church. References for those are in Titus 1:5 through 9 and 1 Timothy 3:1 through 13. Those give the references and the guidelines that Paul gives for elders and deacons in the church.
So what are just a couple of those characteristics?
Yeah, so some of those qualifications would be they must be above reproach, husband of one wife, sober-minded, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not a drunkard, not violent but gentle, not quarrelsome, not a lover of money, manage his own household well, care for God's church, keeping his children submissive, not a recent convert, and well thought by outsiders. And I think... So some
that's
pretty
very
high,
specific, yeah.
Very specific. And so, some people may think that's too conservative. But my kind of overall goal is if you hold to these and their people are fit this description, then they're going to be probably a pretty good person to be qualified to handle that responsibility that comes with any kind of elected position. Additionally, one thing that this says is he must manage his own household well and with dignity. For if someone does not know how to manage his own household, how will he care for God's church? And I think we should apply that same standard to our political leaders as well. If someone can't even make his own bed in the morning, if he can't even, make sure that his family is taken care of and well supported, then we should be hesitant to support them and give them a higher position of authority.
That's so good. I don't think I've ever thought of that before necessarily. So,
what are some things that you look for in political leaders? Or
I think when I am thinking of a political leader and how if I want to support that person, I haven't ever had that thought of looking at a specific scripture passage like you shared, but I look at what do they believe about abortion? Where do they stand on that? Where do they stand on marriage? Where do they stand on your rights in your family? How involved does the government or that person believe that government should be in your family? I think that parents need to be able to raise their own kids, and we're seeing so much of that today where there's a lot of people in government right now that don't believe that should be a thing. they believe that they should be the one raising your kids. So those are the types of things that I look for. And I think that those are like God-given commands. I mean, we know what the Bible says about marriage. We know what the Bible says about life. We know what the Bible says about parenthood and raising children. So it's not necessarily a specific Bible passage. It's just more like biblical ideas.
Yes, and I completely agree, and that is a totally justifiable way of looking at who to elect. However, I would believe that is applicable, the kind of what somebody believes is applicable to just kind of the general elections, when it's, that final ballot that's actually electing people to that position, because you don't really have much of a choice at that point.
Right.
Oftentimes in many of these elections, you're only given two options. And that's why I'm really for individuals, especially moral and Christians, to be getting involved in primary elections, local elections, so that way we can actually pick who's going to be going on the ballot.
Right.
Because then you don't just care about what they believe, you can care about why they believe it.
Sure.
Using the argument of abortion, for instance. You might find somebody who's against abortion, so that's the what. They are against abortion. And you'd be like, I support that. But then you ask them why. Why do you believe that? They might come up with, 5 answers till Sunday, or whatever, and you have some other justification. But, what the Christian answer would be is that we believe that everyone is created in the image of God.
Sure.
And that, even infants in their mother's womb have inalienable rights.
Right.
And so, that's why we as Christians support this, and not for some other political reason or some other jargon that, may come up. And so that's why it's important to be involved in those early elections, those primary elections for your respective political party, so that way you can elect people that have the proper why as to what they believe, not just getting to that general election and getting to just deciding on the what the individual believes. And in that kind of regard, politics is a lot like a sport or like some other skill. If you only use it once every 2 years or once every 4 years, if you only vote for presidential elections, then you're going to be kind of out of the loop. You're not going to be up to date on policy. You're not going to be up to date on the current issues. So it's something that we as citizens, we need to practice and get involved with on a weekly basis, and getting involved in that, so that way we're skillful when it comes time for these larger elections.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And honestly, I've said this actually multiple times to many people over the past 2 years. Until the past 2 years happened, until 2020, I don't think I ever realized the importance of those like smaller elections or the primary elections, like you said. I think we've really realized, okay, what is the role of our city, our mayors and the city councils? What is the role of our governors? And like all of that, we've really been shown over like in 2020 and in 2021 what those roles are, and I don't think I ever realized that before.
Yep, absolutely.
So what makes America like unique politically, I guess, from other governments?
So particularly what makes America unique from past forms of government prior to its existence is it was a constitutional republic. And so I'm sure we've heard that slogan in some kind of civics class or on the television or Schoolhouse Rock. But, we're a government of the people, by the people, for the people.
Yeah.
And so we as citizens of the United States have the obligation to participate in our own governance. And as a result, have our morals and values represented in the political policy of our nation. So that's what makes America unique. And that creates specific duties for us as Christians, where, we are given this responsibility, this privilege of being a United States citizen from God. He allowed us to inherit this, and we have that responsibility. We have the responsibility then to use that privilege of being a United States citizen and having that ability to engage in our politics in this nation, then to glorify Him. Just like we should seek to glorify Him in any other responsibilities and privileges that we are blessed to receive. So,
wow, there's so much to learn, I guess, from that. Yeah.
Well, something else that I wanted to ask you was, we've never heard the phrase, the Bible says to obey government, more than we have in the last 2 years. It has been pounded into our heads. by a lot of different people. And so I wanted to ask you, is that accurate?
Yes. So the Bible says to obey the government. That is 100% true. Now, the most often referenced verse that pertains to this subject matter would be Romans 13, 1 through 7. Another one that from Peter in 1 Peter 2, 13 through 17, both echo the same kind of message and follow each other very well. So I'll read Romans 13, 1 through 7, and we can dive into that a little bit more in detail. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists God, what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval, for he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For because of this, you also pay taxes. For the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed to them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, and honor to whom honor is owed. So that is the most commonly referenced verse that I've found in pertaining to why Christians should obey government. So in short, yes, we should obey government. Yeah. Now, are there exceptions or limitations to that?
Yeah.
That instruction? And that is also a big yes. So I kind of classify it in two major ways. First, if the authority acts contrary to God and his laws, then we are duty bound to disobey them and stick true to what God's teaching and instructions are. The first commandment, Exodus 20, thou shalt not have any other God before me, is very clear. Mm-hmm. And so if you value the authority of government over God, you're placing a government over God at that point, which is in violation of that commandment. So we need to be subject to the governing authorities that are in line with God's principles. Some biblical examples of this, my favorite ones would be Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego would be what they're slave names, as I call it, but I like to call them by their God-given Hebrew names. But they are excellent examples of civic disobedience, of godly disobedience to a tyrannical governing authority in their own day and age. They suffered for it, but God protected them through that. And now a less known example, but I think just as important, would be the Hebrew midwives that are referenced in Exodus 1. Okay. So Shiphrah and Puah were the two that were named specifically, but in general, the Hebrew midwives disobeyed Pharaoh's order to kill all the Jewish males on their birthing tables, basically. Okay. And so, that they feared God more than Pharaoh, and so they did not kill the sons of Israel for that, and they were all blessed and were given families of their own for following God over Pharaoh's decree. So those would be the first. So that's kind of the first exception or limitation. Okay. That is if government is in contrary to God. Second, if the authority acts contrary to right reason or acts unjustly. Okay. So now this one is less commonly known. However, this is one of the founding principles as to why our founding fathers did what they did in rebelling against the crown and the authority of King George to found our nation. Okay. So we know that God is perfectly just, right? He is a source of all justice. Deuteronomy 32:4 supports us in this. So thus, anything unjust then is contrary to God and his nature and is no longer a proper law or authority at that point. That is the line of reasoning that is that supports this theory. I personally believe it to be a theologically and logically sound reasoning. And so some examples that I have going back really early would be Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century, he had written on this, and the founding fathers referenced him and other Christian theologians as well from the classical period as to their justification for their actions that they took against the British crown.
Okay.
So Aquinas states that a tyrannical law, since it is not in accord with reason, is not a law, absolutely speaking. Rather, it is a perversion of law, for it only partakes in the nature of law insofar as it is a ruler's dictate for his subjects and servants to make them duly obedient, that is, to make them good in relation to such a regime, but not absolutely good. And so what Aquinas also talks about is what makes a just law, and a just law has to be in accord with right reason. And he talks a lot about what is right reason, and right reason is reason that is in accordance with God's word.
Okay.
And so James Wilson, I had referenced him earlier, but he's another one of my favorite founding fathers.
Okay.
But he also references in one of his law lectures on the law of nature that but a person who alleges only the law of the strongest proposes no motive to influence the conscience or determine the will. Superior force may reside with predominant malevolence. Has force exerted for the purposes of malevolence a right to command? Can it impose an obligation to obey? No. And resistance to such a force is a right, and if resistance can prove effectual, it is a duty also. And so that was kind of the line of thinking that drove our founding fathers to rebel against the crown, start a revolution, and try to strive for their own country, because they believed that King George was acting tyrannically, and any act that's tyrannical is unjust. And once it's unjust, it goes in contrary to God. Thomas Jefferson, following this line of thinking, proposed our national seal.
Okay.
It was not approved. It was later approved, with the one we see today with the eagle. But originally, it was supposed to be a seal with the inscription that said, "Rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God." And you can see it there. But basically, what it is, it's an inscription that shows Moses and then Pharaoh drowning in the sea. After God closes it and the Israelites are successfully crossed to the other side, and then there's the pillar of fire, which represents the Spirit of God in the background, and that's the center place.
Wow.
And so you can see how ingrained this line of thinking and this reasoning was in our founders.
Yeah.
So those are kind of the two general exceptions then, in my personal opinion, as to why that would be exceptions to our absolute obedience to governing authorities. Just to recap, first, if that authority acts contrary to God and his laws, and then secondary, if that authority acts contrary to right reason or acts unjustly, which would then be acting disobedience towards God and his perfect justice.
Okay. So with all of that in mind, then, what does the Bible say is the role of government?
So in light of Romans 13, we can see that the proper role of government is for rulers to terror and basically deter and punish bad conduct and reward and praise good conduct.
Okay.
And so they're going to be kind of God's arbiters of justice here on earth. That is actually in line with what the founding fathers had said, because if a ruler is acting unjustly and they're praising the wicked and punishing the good, then that ruler then is unjust and deserves to be resisted against, to our utmost, according to James Wilson. So basically, it can be looking at it a little bit more logically. To deter the wicked then would also be like providing for a police force, to enforce, properly and right and just laws.
Sure.
Would also be to have a standing military to protect against foreign invaders and wicked officials, foreign individuals that want to try to invade and wreak havoc on the citizenry. So those would be biblically proper functions of government.
Oh, okay.
And then also taxing to pay for those expenses, because, militaries,
Sure.
police forces, courts,
Sure.
where this adjudication takes place, is not cheap. It's not free. And so they have to be able to fund those endeavors, those endeavors that they're acting as God's arbiters. They have to be able to fund that activity. So taxation then is another proper role of government as well.
Okay. Very interesting. So then, furthermore, with that in mind, let's talk about mandates. Before everyone decides to shut off the episode, we're not going to tell you like what to think, or what to be wearing or what to be getting, but I want to talk about them. Where does bodily autonomy and personal freedom come into play in all of this mandate talk? Does the Bible actually say anything about this?
So looking at mandates and bodily autonomy, to start out and preface this, just go over my personal definition of freedom. So in light of the writings of our founding fathers, the founding documents of our nation, and Christian thinkers, I've come to a definition of freedom that I believe is in accordance with all three of those sources. Freedom is one's ability to act in accordance with the dictates of his conscience and right reason, absent of coercion.
Okay.
And so when applying that same line of thinking then to mandates, there is a certain use of coercion to force individuals to violate their conscience and reason, and that's kind of like the prerequisite of mandates. And so anything that would do such a thing, force an individual to violate his conscience, force him to violate what he reasons is appropriate for himself, would then be unjust. And then according to my secondary limitation on the responsibility of Christians to obey government, that unjust law then is in violation of God's perfect justice, and then thus should be resisted or completely thrown out of public discourse if you have the authority to do so. James Wilson puts it well in some of his writings on law. He says, "Without liberty, law loses its nature, and its name becomes oppression."
Well, what was on that seal again that you read earlier?
So the original seal proposed by Thomas Jefferson said, "Resistance to tyrants is obedience to God."
Which I just feel like all of these mandates are very tyrannical, I guess.
Yes.
Making you choose against your conscience, and oftentimes making you choose like whether or not to support your family and provide for your family.
Yes. Yep.
That's just putting people in such a horrible position.
Oh, 100%. 100% agree with you on that.
Yeah.
And applying it additionally even further to, what we've seen with these COVID mandates and these vaccine mandates in particular, any medical procedure has inherent risks involved. And thus, they cannot be for the complete good of a society, right?
Okay.
And so, because some people will be harmed, so not everyone's going to benefit. Thus, it must be left to the individual to choose at that point, because if you were to mandate it for everybody, then it no longer can be for the common good, because some people will be harmed. The common good, would dictate that it must be, everyone must benefit.
Right.
Everyone must prosper. Everyone must, however, some people are not. With these kind of mandates, because you mandate any medical procedure, any medication, you're going to be those that are allergic, those who have adverse reactions, and those who are more harmed than if they wouldn't have taken it. And so with that, then we can see that those laws that would be not for the common good, these mandates, then would be considered unjust and fall into that exception of the limitations of Christian responsibility to follow and adhere to government instruction.
Yeah. And there's just so much like deceit that goes along with this right now. And people can't actually make an informed decision, even if they have the choice, in whether they, can keep their job. Maybe they work in a place, but we don't even have all the information regarding some of these things. Whether this would cause an adverse reaction in you, whether you would have an allergic reaction, there's just a lot of just deceit and secrecy, I guess.
Yes, absolutely. And that's where, the court of public opinion is very important in that public discourse. If the vaccines, for your age group or demographic are more beneficial for you, then you should be able to analyze that data for yourself
Exactly.
according to your reason, and to determine whether or not for you it's beneficial to take or not take.
Right. Yep. And there's not even like long-term, or we don't, there's no long-term studies yet. We don't know enough to know what is going to happen in the next 5 years to the people who do choose to get that, and it could affect a lot of different things that we just don't know, which is then different than a lot of other vaccines or even medications or products that are in the market right now that have had long-term studies.
Yes, absolutely. And there's even some drugs and pharmaceutical products that have come out in recent years that have had long-term studies, 4 or 5 years out, but then it turns out 20, 30 years down the line, they've had some disastrous effects, either with pregnancies or even the fertility of offspring from individuals that have taken these things. And so to know the entirety of the effects that this is going to have on society in general and on individuals, you don't. And so because of that inherent risk, and because it will inevitably not result into the good of 100% of people, then it must be left up to the individual, and it cannot be mandated. Otherwise, I would consider it 100% to be unjust.
Yeah, absolutely. Another thing that I have seen a lot of, and when it comes to just the vaccine in general, not even about mandates, but a lot of people, including Christians, claim that the vaccine, and it was the same with masks too, when the masks first came out, or, first started becoming a thing, is that they're science. Science proves this. And then they're trying to convince us to love our neighbors. And they use that quote from the Bible, right? And they say that science was designed by God, which is 100% true. Science was designed by God, but because it was designed by God, it's never then going to contradict who God is. And we were created with an immune system, and that's like who God created us to have. And it's also like just logical then. We have these immune systems, and when our natural immunity to anything is built up and it's protected, we're able to fight viruses and sickness. And we build that immunity by having a healthy diet and by going for walks and being in the sunshine. And then that strong immune system decreases our chances. It doesn't guarantee that we're not going to get sick, but our bodies are going to know how to fight it. But we're told to stay inside, wear a cloth over our face if we go outside, and we're told to that science is going to come and save the day with this vaccine. But there are medications and treatments or whatever that have been used for decades and sometimes even centuries that are being hidden right now. That they've gone through the proper channels of testing and whatnot, and they've proven to be effective in different ways, and they're being completely like pulled off the shelf, hidden, canceled, whatever you want to call it. I feel like our government who is pushing the vaccine, we should have tried to eradicate this virus by being outside, by taking vitamins when we need to supplement our vitamins. You know what I mean? And this vaccine is not pointing to God at all. It's not pointing to God's science, because it's pointing to our government, and it's pointing to big pharma, and media is promoting it. It's not pointing to the Lord and the Creator.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And so with that, that claim that, science is from God, and thus it can't contradict God. This is true. However, science is a faculty of man, and man can corrupt it.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
And that's what we've been seeing. And so when someone uses the blanket term science or listen to the science, yet they do not explain that, and they just use that as kind of a billy club to beat people into submission in their arguments or discourse, then that raises concern. Because God also equipped all of us with reason and with consciences. And so if our reason and conscience is telling us not to not get these, and our risk determination determines that we shouldn't get these vaccines or what have you, or there's other alternatives that are more effective that we can see and determine and deduce are more effective for us in our specific circumstance, then we should be free to choose those alternatives. And if these vaccines are good, or these miracle drugs that the media has been promoting, then they should be able to share and argument these studies and this data that would be coming from that if they were as such. Whereas we're actually seeing the opposite of that. We're seeing these becoming increasingly ineffective. We're seeing them to becoming more harmful, especially as the booster shots have increased. The VAERS data is very clear that these are causing thousands of deaths directly. And so to mandate something like this then would be completely unjust.
Exactly. And I just want to repeat for the listeners that we're saying that this should be a personal choice. And being able to look at that data that Johnny's talking about is part of that personal choice, and being able to make that for yourself. But mandating it for society as a whole, or for even a workplace, it's just, it's wrong and can cause a lot of harm. So before we close, I always like to ask people, do you have a resource to recommend to learn more about this? Because this is just a very small skim an iceberg type of conversation, So do you have a resource that you can recommend to the listeners?
Yes, absolutely, I do. So I think one of the best books that I've read in terms of getting to know and properly understand the role of governance and the role that a moral populace must have in our governance is Did America Have a Christian Founding by Mark David Hall. So the book does a very, very good job. I quoted it a couple times with different references from a few individuals, but it basically just clarifies the misconception of the separation of church and state that we've heard so much in our lives and in recent history, how that was a complete misreading and misunderstanding of what the founders' intentions were with our governance and government systems. It also does a very good job of explaining the role that Christianity had in our founding and how important and integral it is to the preservation of our nation.
I will link that in the show notes then for the people who are listening. So thank you, Johnny, so much for coming on and having this conversation. It's been really fun.
Yeah, it was great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Thanks for listening, everybody. I'm so glad you tuned in for today's conversation. I hope you are leaving uplifted in your walk with the Lord, because that is my prayer for this podcast. You can follow me on Instagram and Facebook at In All Things Pod, and I would love it if you invited more friends into our conversations. You can also visit my website at inallthingspodcast.com. If this episode was encouraging to you, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts or your favorite listening platform, because it helps the algorithms and it allows In All Things to be accessible to more people. See you next time.